There is one question that sits at the center of everything. It doesn't matter whether you're skeptical, it doesn't matter whether you're convinced, it doesn't matter how many reports you've read or how many videos you've seen. Eventually, everyone arrives at the same point, and the question is simple. Where's the proof? Not speculation, not testimony, not analysis. Proof. Something clear, something undeniable, something that ends the conversation. Because that's what we're used to in science, in law, in everyday life. When something is real, there is evidence. And when there is evidence, it can be shown. So why, after decades of sightings, reports, programs, and now official investigations, does that proof never arrive? Why is it always just out of reach? Why does it always feel like we're close, but never quite there? Because the problem isn't just what we're looking at. The problem is how we expect proof to exist. Welcome back to UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I am your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for joining. Please subscribe on Spotify and share the episode. Today's is titled The Evidence Problem: Why Proof Never Arrives. When people say they want proof, they usually imagine something very specific, a physical object, something that can be touched, examined, tested, verified, or something equally definitive. A clear image, a piece of technology, a document that confirms everything. Something that removes doubt, something that ends debate, something that forces agreement, because that's how evidence works in most areas of life. If a crime is committed, you look for physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, forensic analysis, and eventually a conclusion is reached. If a scientific discovery is made, you expect repeatable results, peer-reviewed validation, measurable outcomes. And once those standards are met, the question is settled. So naturally, people expect the same thing here. A craft, a body, a definitive signal, something that proves beyond any doubt that what we're dealing with is real. Now, we need to pause because this is where the misunderstanding begins. The expectation of proof is based on systems that are open, repeatable, and observable. But the UAP problem exists inside a system that is none of those things. It exists inside classified environments, restricted access, and fragmented data, which means the conditions required for traditional proof don't exist. Now, this is critical. You cannot expect open system evidence from a closed system, and that single mismatch explains almost everything that follows. Instead of proof, the system produces something else, not objects, not definitive artifacts. It produces data, sensor data, radar tracks, infrared signatures, pilot reports. Individually, none of these are conclusive, but collectively, they form patterns. Patterns that suggest something is happening, but do not fully explain what that something is. So instead of proof, the system produces persistent ambiguity. Now, we go deeper, because even when data exists, it doesn't automatically become proof. For data to become proof, it must be accessible, verifiable, and repeatable. And in this case, those conditions are rarely met. The first reason is classification. Much of the data is classified, which means it cannot be shared. Reason 2 is context. Data without context is incomplete, and context itself is often restricted. Reason 3, fragmentation. No single data set tells the full story. Everything exists in pieces. So the result, even when data exists, it cannot be assembled into a complete picture. Now we arrive at the core constraint: national security, because the system handling UAP is not a scientific institution, it is a defense system, and defense systems operate differently. Their priority is not truth, it is risk management, which means information is controlled, capabilities are protected, and exposure is limited. Even if definitive evidence existed, it would not necessarily be released, because releasing it could expose technologies, reveal capabilities, and create vulnerability. Now, if we look at the compartmentalisation problem, and we've touched on this before, but now we expand it. Inside the system, information is divided. No single person has full visibility, which means analysts see data, pilots see encounters, and officials see summaries, but no one sees everything. What this creates is a situation where the full picture may exist, but no individual can present it. And this connects directly to our last episode. When insiders come forward, they bring credibility, but not proof, because they are bound by classification, legal constraints, and incomplete access. So whistleblowers provide signals, not definitive evidence. Now we see the gap clearly. The public expects clear proof, but the system produces fragmented data, and that mismatch creates frustration. People assume evidence is being hidden, when in reality, evidence may not exist in the form they expect. So now we arrive at the core issue: not lack of evidence, but misalignment of expectations. The system is not designed to produce proof. It is designed to manage uncertainty. And that means the outcome is not resolution, but ongoing ambiguity. Now, if we go back not to the present, but to the beginning of this story, we see something that hasn't changed. Since the late 1940s, there have been reports, not one, not 10, thousands. Pilots, military personnel, civilians, all describing objects that didn't behave as expected. And from the very start, the same question followed: where's the proof? So investigation began. Projects were created, efforts were made to understand what was being seen. And what did they find? They found patterns. They found unexplained cases. They found observations that didn't fully resolve. And they did not find definitive proof. And that pattern repeats across decades, across programs, across technologies. No matter how much data is collected, no matter how advanced the systems become, the result is always the same. Something is observed, something is recorded, but nothing is fully explained. Now let's step into science, because this is where people expect answers. Science is designed to observe, test, repeat, verify. And under those conditions, it works exceptionally well. But the UAP problem doesn't exist under those conditions. It is not controlled, it is not repeatable, and it is not consistently observable. You cannot bring a UAP into a laboratory. You cannot trigger an encounter on demand. You cannot run controlled experiments. And without those conditions, science cannot produce definitive conclusions. This doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the phenomenon does not behave in a way that fits scientific method. Now we move into something even more important, the sensor paradox. Because while science struggles, technology improves. Sensors become more advanced, systems become more capable, and you would expect that better technology would lead to better answers. But instead, something unexpected happens. The better the sensors become, the more anomalies they detect. Not fewer, but more. And this is the sensor paradox. Improved observation does not eliminate the unknown, it expands it. Because now the system is capable of seeing things it couldn't see before. and not all those things are understood. Even when something is detected, there is another problem: context. Data on its own is incomplete. A radar return shows movement, an infrared image shows heat, a pilot report describes behavior, but none of these on their own tell the full story. And when you try to combine them, you run into limitations because each data set is collected differently, processed differently, and often restricted. So even when multiple sources, you still don't get a complete picture. Everything exists in pieces. This is the fragmentation problem. Different agencies hold different data. Different systems capture different aspects. Different classifications limit access. So instead of one clear data set, you now have fragments. Fragments that cannot always be combined. And without combination, there is no synthesis. And without synthesis, there is no proof. Now, we need to consider something uncomfortable here. What if definitive evidence did exist? Would it be released? Not necessarily, because definitive evidence would have consequences. It could reveal technological gaps, expose system limitations, and create geopolitical instability. And systems are designed to avoid instability. So even in a scenario where something is confirmed, the response would not automatically be full disclosure. And this leads to a critical distinction. There is a difference between knowing something internally and proving it externally. The system may reach internal conclusions, but those conclusions rely on classified data, depend on restricted context, and cannot be publicly demonstrated. So even if understanding exists, it does not translate into public proof. At this point, we can see why ambiguity is not an accident. It is structural. Ambiguity exists because data is incomplete, access is restricted, systems are fragmented, and disclosure is controlled. And all those factors combine to produce the same outcome. Not definitive proof, but also no definitive dismissal. So what does the system produce? Not answers, not conclusions. It produces ongoing analysis, continuous observation, and incremental understanding, but never final resolution. At this point, we need to separate two ideas that are often treated as the same, but they're not: truth and proof. Truth is something that exists, whether it can demonstrate it or not. Proof is something that can be shown, something that can be verified, something that can be accepted by others. And in most areas of life, those two things align. If something is true, we can prove it. But in this case, they may not. There may be truths that cannot be proven publicly, not because they aren't real, but because the conditions required for proof don't exist. This is where the system operates differently from the public. The public wants proof, clarity, and resolution. The system does not, because the system's objective is not to prove what something is, it's to demonstrate whether it matters. If something poses no threat, it can be deprioritized. If something cannot be understood, it can still be monitored. Proof is not required for action. Now, action without understanding, this is uncomfortable because it challenges how we think about knowledge. We assume that understanding comes first and action follows. But in complex systems, that's not always true. Sometimes action comes first: observation, tracking, monitoring, all happening without full understanding. And that's exactly what we're seeing. From the outside, this creates a constant expectation. People believe proof is coming, that one day there will be a definitive reveal, a confirmed explanation, a final answer. But that expectation is based on a system that doesn't exist here, because the UAP problem does not move toward closure. it moves toward management. And now we arrive at something deeper, the structure of permanent uncertainty. This may not be a problem that can be solved. It may be a condition that must be managed, a condition where observations continue, data accumulates, and understanding evolves, but never fully resolves because the inputs are inconsistent, unpredictable, and incomplete. And that creates something unusual, a system that is permanently engaged without ever reaching a final answer. Now, we consider the alternative. What if proof did arrive? Clear, definitive, undeniable? It would change everything, not just the conversation, but scientific priorities, geopolitical dynamics, and public perception. And systems do not handle sudden change well. So even in a scenario where clarity exists, it would likely be introduced slowly, controlled, managed, which means even proof would not appear as proof. Now we step back and look at the pattern again, the reoccurring pattern. The system observes anomalies, attempts to understand them, encounters limitations, produces data, maintains ambiguity. The public demands proof, interprets signals, fills the gaps, and continues to ask questions. And the cycle continues, not once, but repeatedly, across decades, across programs, and across technologies. So we return to the question we started with: where is the proof? And the answer is not hidden, and it is not withheld in the way people imagine. The answer is this: proof as we expect it is not being produced, not because nothing exists, but because the system does not generate that kind of proof. So let's step back one final time. We're not dealing with a lack of evidence. We're dealing with a mismatch between expectation and reality. The public expects certainty. The system produces ambiguity. The public expects answers. The system produces ongoing analysis. And in between those two is the tension that drives everything. So the final assessment is that the evidence problem is not a failure of data. It is a structural outcome of how the system operates. And until that structure changes, the result will remain the same. No definitive proof, but also no definitive resolution. Because in the end, this is not just a story about UAPs. It's a story about how we understand reality and what happens when reality doesn't behave the way we expect it to. The question doesn't go away. It doesn't get answered. It stays open. And that may be the most important insight of all. This is UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I'm your host, Matt Tones, and I'd like to leave you with one last thought. Sometimes the most important question is not what is the proof, but what if proof was never the outcome to begin with? Please subscribe and share this episode and tell your mom.